quite a dismal concept. So I'd like to start off by sharing something that, well, will put things into perspective. Oh dear, let's see where it is. Ah, what a pity. I'm about to pull it up. I thought I had it at hand. I do now. Okay, good. Let's get back to sharing. And first of all, let me admit newcomers and share my screen. So what I'd like to do is just show you a presentation that I'm preparing. And what you should be able to see is that actually lockdown is not all that bad. These are the lions in the Kruger Park, and they're actually enjoying the fact that they don't have to be, let's say, moving away from our normal, or from the normal activities, which is human beings invading their space. So I thought that was quite an interesting, I picked it up this morning, quite an interesting perspective. So for some of us, it's actually quite a relief to be in lockdown. Okay, let me get to the business at hand. So today, what I'd like to share with you is some of the changes and some of the initiatives that are going to impact our lives, certainly for the next year or so. Let me admit some more people. Right. Specifically as these apply to supply chains. And we're all painfully aware now of just how much we rely on supply chains, either because we are part of a supply chain in terms of our work, or whether we are at the receiving end of the supply chain because we are the consumer. And I'm sure you've all had an experience where you've gone into a store and not been able to find what it is that you're looking for, specifically hand sanitizer. And I guess the discussion today is really about why you can't find what you need when you need it, specifically hand sanitizers. Why are there no hand sanitizers in pharmacies and in our supermarkets? What's changed, I think, for us today is that supply chains globally have been exposed to a stress test. So coronavirus is the stress test for supply chains, and they haven't actually passed the stress test. Supply chains around the world have failed. Some indeed have stopped altogether. They've just broken down, as it were. So it's evidenced by the fact that we don't have enough protective clothing for our medical staff. We don't have enough testing equipment. We don't have enough testing teams, the manpower to go out and to do as much testing as this country needs. And it isn't just our problem. It's not a South African issue. It's a global issue. All supply chains, particularly supply chains in healthcare, have come under immense strain. And new words are entering our vocabulary. Words like visibility and resilience, transparency. Let me admit some more attendees, and sustainability. And these are typically words that were only used in organizations by specialists. They were very technical terms. And suddenly they've come into everyday usage, simply because the supply chains that we're a part of, and they are complex supply chains, have let us down. The next aspect which has come to the fore is the fact that just in time, JIT, which has been seen for years now as the epitome of supply chain performance, the solution to a top performing organization, has in fact failed. It's the reason why you can't get hand sanitizer when you go to the stores. Or if you can get some, you're limited to how much you can buy. JIT, which was an initiative seen as a must-have for all supply chains, has in fact failed. And it's shown us, it's demonstrated just how fragile supply chains are. Irrespective of the sophistication or the efficiency or the complexity, they are indeed very fragile. And this fragility has meant that when there is massive disruption, and COVID-19 is a huge disruptor, these supply chains are not resilient, they're not robust, and they're unable to adapt to the new living requirements or the new living standards or the new life as we know it now. So what has caused these changes? The first, let's say, driver of this change is the fact that consumers are far more savvy. Consumers have developed, because they are better informed, they have developed a continuous expectation for better quality, an improved cost, price, lower prices, and in fact, greater service. Because of this increased demand, it's put all organizations, companies, and organizations that interact with consumers, and most in the world do, under a lot of pressure. And this has been exacerbated by globalization. Globalization for the last 20 years was seen as the answer to growing market share, to increasing the number of customers. How do you keep your business resilient or sustainable when you have exhausted your potential, your market share, or your potential for growth in your own country? Well, globalization says look for customers anywhere else. And for suppliers and manufacturers, the answer to achieving low costs, whether it was labor costs or material costs, was go global and find a cheaper source somewhere else on the planet. So globalization was the answer to achieving continued growth and revenue and higher revenues. The next driver is a movement by all organizations to reduce the number of suppliers. This was an initiative to achieve the lowest cost by being able to concentrate on 2 or 3 suppliers, giving a lot of your business to them and shutting out all the other competitors in that particular space. And this has proved to be very dangerous, because when one of those suppliers or more of those suppliers are unable to supply you, it leaves you with very few choices as a supply chain director, supply chain professional. Where do you go for more of those products or services that you're looking for? So an example would be face masks. The president told us last evening that we should all wear face masks in public. A good thing. It's being done around the world, and most countries source their face masks, their surgical masks, from China, because China was a very efficient provider, a supplier of that particular item. It was also very affordable, low cost, and it was at that stage reliable. So all of the countries that purchased these items did that from China. Well, what happened? China became unable to continue to be that reliable supplier. And with that breakdown, it made companies turn to other sources. Well, the interesting thing is that South Africa was able to supply its own, but the buyers of face masks in South Africa moved to importing from China simply because the costs from China were much lower. So the manufacturers of masks in South Africa effectively just fell out of they fell out of the program. They were not able to continue to produce face masks in the quantities that were needed by the country because they were no longer receiving the orders. The big orders were all going to China. So the reduction of the supplier base has actually become a world problem, a global problem. And then the next driver is the volatility of markets. And we've seen that in the last 5 years, it's been one volatile cycle after another. And the thinking generally is, well, this is a short-term period of volatility, and we'll settle down and we'll go back to normal when it's over. Well, it hasn't proven to be the case. There's been new volatility which has been brought in from other sources. There's volatility from a number of sources, whether it's a dispute between America and China in terms of pricing, a price war effectively, whether it's disruption to supply chains because of war and societal disorders in Yemen, whether it's the fact that Brexit, the British want to pull out of the European Union. All of those have brought volatility, and volatility will continue. So what this tells us is that volatility is not a short-term thing. There will be renewed and different volatility on a continuous basis. And that has shown us how fragile our supply chains are because they're not able to deal with the volatility. Interestingly enough, Bill Gates did a TED talk in 2015, and he predicted then that the next big shock to the global economy would in fact be disease, a pandemic. And here we are 5 years later, and that's exactly what's happening. So let's look at the concepts that are coming to the fore now and how those have, because they have been ignored or they were not a focal point, how they have actually resulted in where we are today. So the first one is the aspect of visibility. So what visibility is all about is how much of your supply chain are you able as the buyer to see. Today, supply chains have become very complex. Some of the complexity is unfathomable. In fact, if you look below the first tier of suppliers, there can be 11 or 12 subcontractors. And with such a level of subcontracting, it's very difficult to understand exactly what's going on everywhere in your supply chain. You have direct contact and knowledge of your agent, for example, in China, but you don't really know beyond your agent that you deal with, who else is involved in supplying the product and the service that you require. This degree of complexity means that we don't really understand the difficulties or the changes that could happen in our supply chain in parts of the world that we rely on and we don't even understand very clearly. And COVID-19 has in fact shown us just that we don't understand in detail what's happening in our supply chain. They've become very distant, very complex, invisible, and we need to bring that visibility back. The next concept is resilience. So typically, resilience means that when there's a shock to your supply chain, if your supply chain is robust, it will be able to adjust very quickly to those shocks, to that disruption. And we can see today that that is not the case. Supply chains around the world have collapsed, and some of them have collapsed in areas where the world is most needy, and that is healthcare. We've seen some examples of how supply chains can turn around to try and adjust what their supply chains provide to the new reality. So one example is the fashion houses. And what we've seen is in Europe and in other areas, the fashion houses like Dior like Louis Vuitton, they've actually started manufacturing masks. And there's a slide presentation that goes with this, and there's more information there. So what happens with these masks is there are two types. They're made by the fashion houses for surgical use, and those are given free of charge to the hospitals. And then they make a fashion mask, which is branded according to the company's logos or the company's brand, and those are sold to the public. So this is one way of pulling resilience back into your supply chain, because nobody's buying fashion right now. The stores are closed. There's no demand for fashion items. There will be, but not right now. So those supply chains are idle, and they've converted their manpower to something that is useful and society needs. And another one, which is one closer to home, is Sasol. Clearly, Sasol has struggled for many reasons recently, but one of them is the fact that fuel is not in big demand right now. And we've seen that from the way that the oil price has actually behaved. So what Sasol has done is converted some of this production line to manufacturing the chemicals which are used in hand sanitizer. Previously, Sasol didn't produce that because it produced it at such a high cost that the sanitizer chemicals from China were much cheaper. But what we're seeing now is that there's capacity at Sasol. Their normal products are not in high demand. They have the ability and the know-how and the technology to produce chemicals. So they've converted their supply chain to providing chemicals for sanitizers, which South Africa needs. And then another global example, there's a need everywhere for ventilators. Ventilators are used by patients who have contracted the virus and who are struggling because it's a the virus congests the chest. And so the patients suffer and they can't breathe because of this congestion, and that's where you need ventilators. So General Motors and Mercedes-Benz, whose business is really not about ventilators or healthcare, they've converted their production lines to manufacturing ventilators, because they again have the know-how, and they also have the component parts to produce these ventilators, because they're not selling an awful lot of cars right now. So this gives you some initiative or some indication of the initiatives that are being taken by supply chains to try and regain resilience. And the last concept, which I'd like to share with you or discuss with you, is that of sustainability. One of the consequences of globalization was outsourcing. What companies did, and many companies in South Africa did that, instead of producing locally, they outsourced that item or that production to somewhere else in the world where the costs were cheaper, the cost of labor were cheaper than South African costs, and they were able to offer that service to customers at a lower cost. So that was basically known as offshoring. I'll give you an example. We had a very, very vibrant and thriving textile industry in South Africa. We made excellent products. Not only did we manufacture good materials, good textiles, but we also manufactured them in a very sophisticated and effective way. But unfortunately, the costs were very high. So retailers in South Africa moved their business to China. Now, most garments that we buy from Pick n Pay or Woolworths are actually made in China or some other source which is not in South Africa. And that's basically destroyed the industry in South Africa. The textile industry in South Africa is really non-existent, which is a great shame, because we had the skill, we had the talent, we had the know-how, we had the capacity, and now we no longer have that, which is a shame. But things could change because that movement is being reversed. Nations are now realizing that they've outsourced too much. So this drive towards lean manufacturing and just-in-time production has meant that we've leaned too far as organizations. As supply chains, we are have leaned too far, and we've leaned so far that we're actually falling over. So now they're reversing that movement and onshoring, bringing that production of critical items to South Africa. For example, face masks back into the country. So now we are producing, or will hopefully produce them back in South Africa, which has a really good spin-off, job creation, etc. Then this reluctance or this reliance on just a few, one or two suppliers, that's changing, because the effect of that is that if we had 100 suppliers of face masks around the world, but China was the cheapest, those other 99 would have either been not very successful, and certainly many of them would have just dropped out of the market, and the others would have been driven to specialization and only making very specialized face masks and not your average normal face mask, simply because they couldn't compete with China. So what's happening now is there's an investment in those suppliers which previously were marginalized, bringing them back in, growing their businesses so they themselves can actually become more competitive, and agreeing as a buyer not to drive for the lowest cost, but to look at the best value. And the best value is often made in South Africa and consumed in South Africa, and much less reliant on foreign suppliers. And the last initiative, which is I think, a reaction to this global crisis, is developing capability within South Africa. Capability for any particular item or service that's necessary to keep the South African economy going. And that's an investment back into South Africa. And developing skills to be able to enhance the capability for a number of things. By way of example, and I don't know if it's feasible or if Sasol is considering doing that, but it's certainly possible that Sasol could decide to create a smaller division that is specialized in chemicals specifically for hand sanitizer, or chemicals that might be used in hospitals, simply because we don't want to be reliant on foreign suppliers and find that when we need the particular item that our country is relying on, we can't get it because of some disruption to their supply chains. So those are the initiatives that are we're going to see more of them, and they're going to develop and promote pulling back of resources, of capacity, and of opportunity into South Africa. And those are definitely positive moves resulting from COVID-19. They're not going to happen immediately, but over time, we will then become more self-reliant rather than, oh, sorry, Maria, I didn't see your message. I'm not speaking loud enough. Okay, here we go. It's because I get carried away, so forgive me. So those initiatives that I talked about, the sustainability, the bringing back onshoring of capacity, developing local suppliers, and increasing South Africa's capability in certain areas, not all areas, but certain areas, that is going to be a shift, a focus for the future. Let's talk about another concept, which I'd like to leave you with today. I've got a little bit more to share with you, but a concept that I'd like to discuss with you, and that is the answer to the question, is COVID-19 a black swan event? So to start off with, I'd like to explain a little bit what a black swan event is. And this was a term, a metaphor that was developed some years ago to describe an event that was hugely disruptive. It was completely unexpected, unpredicted. It couldn't have been planned for because it was so out of the ordinary. And it really was so rare that there was no point in adjusting your supply chain to what was known as a black swan event. So some examples of a black swan event would be in 2011, the Fukushima, the tsunami that hit Fukushima and destroyed that power station. Another black swan event would have been in 2001, September the 11th attack on the Twin Towers in America. And in 2008, 2009, the credit crisis, basically the financial collapse, the global financial collapse in 2008, 2009. But the question we have to ask ourselves is COVID-19 a black swan event? Is it indeed something that is so unpredictable, that is rare, that we can say, well, we couldn't possibly have planned for it? Let's put this into context and remember that a few short years ago, there was a SARS outbreak, again from China, and that was also a respiratory disease. And there were other epidemic events. In Brazil, there was a particular one, I forget the name now, but that was an epidemic, which didn't necessarily impact South Africa, but it certainly had a significant impact in some areas of the world. So could those not have been warnings to us as a society and to economies to say, you know, this could happen again? It's not to say that SARS was just a one-off and we'll never see a resurgence. So I would argue that it's not a black swan. We should have been able to predict that these kinds of diseases might happen. We had the outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo of Ebola, and that's not really put to bed. That continues. A lot of suffering is happening in that part of Africa. So in essence, this should be, if it hasn't already been, a warning to all healthcare systems around the world to, I think, give them a heads up to say these things could happen again in different shape, different form, from different sources, but they could happen again. So given the fact that I don't believe, and you can make up your own mind, I don't believe that COVID-19 is a black swan event. What does our society look like after COVID-19? What are the ways of working? In fact, what will the ways of working look like when we move to stage 4, or level 4 of our lockdown, which is what the President announced last evening? Well, ways of working will be working from home for those who can. It will also mean that those who do have to go to work will have to be tested. So companies have an obligation. Let me admit a new number. And so companies will have to do testing, temperature testing, or some form of testing that ensures that the staff members that are at work are not infected. And at the end of the day, before they go home, they may have to test again to make sure that they didn't get infected at the office. And that's a huge responsibility for any organization. It also means that when we are in a public environment, apart from wearing face masks, we also have to be very mindful of social distance. It's going to be difficult, I think, particularly in Africa, but all over the world. It's a problem in Italy. I come from Italy originally, and it's a close society. People get up close and personal. It's the way they live. So keeping a distance is very foreign, and it will be difficult in Africa for people to just stay 1 or 2 meters away from each other. And that's going to be a challenge, because it does mean that we put people around us at risk. We may not even know that we are, in fact, infected, because we may have no symptoms. So the new ways of working, the new ways of moving in society are going to be quite different from now on. And there will also be dramatic changes to supply chains. We're going to see supply chains reinvent themselves. The supply chains that you are a part of, in other words, the way you go to work or the way that you behave when you're at work, you have to be far more careful of what you touch and to how close you stand to your colleagues. And you also have to be very mindful of your part in that supply chain, so that you are a constructive and flexible member of that supply chain. And surely as an individual, a consumer at the end of the supply chain, you're going to have to behave differently as well, because you're going to have to be willing and prepared to adjust to the fact that you may not get everything you need from your supermarket. When you walk into the supermarket, you may be compelled to buy online, because it may actually be the safest method to protect yourself and keep yourself from possibly infecting other people. So supply chain managers around the world, but certainly in South Africa, have to develop a new thinking, a new way of seeing themselves as intermediaries, but also as looking at all the members of their supply chain and how the interactions will be in the future. And we're going to have to look much more at technology, just as we're looking at technology now, in terms of how do we communicate with each other, because we aren't going to be able to come together in a room and have this dialogue. So how do we do that at a distance? We're using technology. Supply chains are going to have to do the same thing. They're going to come into a new era of relying much more heavily on technology to get resilience and visibility and information about the supply chains. So we have a few minutes left, and I'd like to end off with a challenge. And the challenge to you is, how are you going to improve your supply chain and make yourself resilient and more robust so that your supply chain is more sustainable? And then to start thinking about, if COVID is not a black swan event, what do we need as participants in this economy? How do we need to contribute to preventing or at least mitigating these risks? Because what's very clear is that supply chains around the world have not evaluated risk effectively, and certainly haven't put in risk management processes which are effective. And that's clear everywhere. We've seen adjustment, yes, but no one has been able to adequately address the risks that are being brought upon us by this pandemic. So risk management has to be seen in a whole new light for organizations, but for families as well, and for individuals. So risk management has become an absolutely essential skill and capability for members of supply chains, for the entire supply chain, and for members of society. I'm not sure, Maria, can you tell me if we've got an opportunity to answer questions, or if that should be the end? We have quite a number of participants, so answering questions could be quite lengthy, but I'm quite happy if anyone has a burning issue to raise, I'm quite happy to address it. No? That's a very mini. How will this affect employment in the future? Well, certainly there will be an increased need globally for supply chain professionals. There is no doubt about that. There will also be a requirement for supply chain professionals to be specialized in a particular area. So you will have to be a generalist, in other words, very good at all the areas of the supply chain. But also you'll have to have a specialization. Maybe it's procurement, maybe it's logistics, maybe it's risk management, maybe it's research. So there will be opportunities for growth in the supply chain in terms of job creation, but not in the immediate future. What it does mean to other jobs is that if supply chains reinvent themselves, some jobs may fall away altogether. And we must drive for reskilling our people in those areas of the supply chain which are becoming obsolete. We must reskill them because there are other opportunities. And if we pull them into these new opportunities, we'll be able to actually save jobs or at least prevent the disasters of unemployment. Because unemployment is going to, we've seen it already, and it's been a problem for many years, but it's going to become particularly serious for us now. So I hope, Minnie, that I've answered your question. Herman, definitely less mechanistic. Mechanistic approaches imply a kind of efficiency. So if you have a very fixed and mechanized solution, you limit the possibilities for variation. And that is very good for efficiency. So mechanizing or mechanization is good because it improves efficiency. But improving efficiency, what it completely raises is flexibility. And what we need now is flexibility in our supply chains. So yes, the approach to supply chains will be looking for greater flexibility, and even if that means that you must relinquish some of the mechanistic or mechanical responses which have increased your efficiency. So efficiency may reduce, but flexibility will increase. The challenge will be, how do we get the best of both? Tebi has a question. With social distancing being the norm and JIT not working, how will businesses cope with demand in the future? That's an excellent question, and we don't have a finite answer. But one way of, in the short term, addressing it is to rely on your supply chain partners. No entity, no business in a supply chain can have all the answers and all the solutions to the problems we're facing now. So what is going to happen is you're going to have to bring in other partners or other members into your supply chain that increase your flexibility. They hopefully maintain efficiency up to a certain point. But what they do is they spread the risk so that you aren't, as a business, completely isolated. And that is one of the measures that will be taken, I think, well, definitely, to be able to increase or meet demand and also reduce the inefficiencies in our supply chains. Sorry, I just need to go back to find the questions. Okay, so that was Tebi's question. I have another one from Njabulu. Yep, you're absolutely right, Njabulu. Economies, countries will actually want to be self-sufficient. So they, in many areas, obviously not, let me give you an example. Italy can never be self-sufficient in mining. It just doesn't have the wherewithal. So obviously it can't develop its own mining industry. South Africa is very sophisticated and world-class in mining. So that's not an area that we need to focus on, or that Italy needs to focus on. However, we have reduced our capacity, our industrial capacity, because we're not manufacturing as much as we should, as we have been in the past. So manufacturing was much, much more prominent in South Africa in the past. So yes, absolutely. Our economy will basically insource or onshore and focus on developing those capabilities or regaining those capabilities. Good question. Right, let me go on to the next one. Minnie says, I have experienced that our supply chain staff are always away and not in the office. Can this create more admin employment? Well, that's interesting. That's actually a very interesting observation, because if you move into technology, the requirements, the employment will be in a technology environment, not for pure admin. So you're going to see a shift. Your supply chain people probably should be where the action is, not in the office. But that doesn't mean to say that you're going to need more clerks in the office. It means that you're going to have more people that are skilled with technology in the office to handle those administrative functions. Good question. Oh, we have more time. Thank you, Maria. All righty. Sihle, in light of a push by Japan and the USA to incentivize manufacturing companies to move out of China, I guess in an effort to avoid future single sourcing, how can South Africa benefit? Well, South Africa isn't ready. And we have, unfortunately, for what seemed to be at the time good reasons, put all our eggs in a Chinese basket. So those moves that are being driven by Japan and America, those should happen around the world where it's possible, and they absolutely have to take place in South Africa. I think there's a realization that we have to, I'm sorry, there's someone who's joining us now, there's the realization that we have to become self-sufficient. We have to improve our manufacturing capability, not for everything. They're just some things. For example, there would be absolutely no sense in South Africa trying, I believe, my opinion, to start making microchips. It's a very expensive operation to set up, and we already have very efficient suppliers around the world. But we may have to start relooking at our place in that supply chain, even if we don't necessarily manufacture. Perhaps we have another role to play. So that's another excellent, thank you, Sihle. That's another excellent question. We aren't ready, but by goodness, we have to become ready in certain areas. We cannot afford, because what Japan and the USA have done is they were so reliant that their own industries couldn't carry on manufacturing because they were short of components from China. So it's a great observation. Thanks, Sihle. And now Njabulu. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Economies will be driven to be more self-dependent, self-sufficient, and develop their own means of production where it's reasonable. As I say, in some cases, it just doesn't make any sense. The example of Italy and mining, there's no mining in Italy. There never has been, other than back in before the Romans in the Stone Ages, which then, of course, was not very sophisticated. It just wouldn't make any sense for them to play in that space. So how do you see the just-in-time concept playing out in the near future? Will it not increase stocking and storing? In some cases, it should and must. The question is, how exactly do you do that? Because just-in-time was a drive to reduce costs. You can still use just-in-time, but you have to set it up differently, because if it's set up specifically to keep low inventories and to source from low-cost sources only, you are running on such a lean manufacturing platform that any little shock, any disruption is actually going to stop your supply chain dead in its tracks. So yes, there will be an increased stock holding. There will also be an increase of suppliers, more suppliers supplying those things, and they won't necessarily be supplying at the lowest cost. For example, Germany was a manufacturer of masks. It's now manufacturing very sophisticated ones, but it can manufacture anywhere. So essentially, importing from Germany is going to be more expensive than bringing in from China. But that's a possibility. Increase your suppliers, and ultimate goal would be make your own masks and do them well. So not only can you make for South Africa, you can also become an exporter of masks. Okay. Move to the next one. So the answer to S. Lal, is, yes, indeed, we're going to see increased stocking and increased storage. Again, it's got to be a fine balance. You can't have endless inventory. That would be foolish. But it's finding the right balance. Let me go down. Boss M says, is the IMM taking cognizance of these new issues, and are you going to incorporate this into the syllabus somehow? We certainly are. There will be some changes. Obviously, they can't be done immediately. We've got to do our research because a lot of the stuff is really happening now. So we are in the process of researching, but it will definitely be integrated. Our curriculum is current, and we invest heavily in keeping it current. Mareka? I think it's inevitable that companies will move to digital marketing. It's if they haven't thought it was worthwhile before, they certainly would find it worthwhile now, because they will be very restrained in many of the other marketing initiatives. So they would definitely have to be exploring it. And many customers would, I'm not an expert on digital marketing, but many customers will be responding to that sort of marketing initiative. It would be foolish for a company to ignore that opportunity. And then he says, and with current environment we find ourselves in, can this cause more job creation in SA? It should. Old factories working again, absolutely. That's going to need investment in capital. I think companies abroad and locally would be happy to invest in those kinds of initiatives, but they need certainty. They need certainty, for example, in terms of the energy. Will that Eskom be able to provide enough energy? Will there be enough support from government in terms of providing incentives for companies to invest in South Africa? So certainly those initiatives I think we will see. Certainly in the key areas, we will see that evolving. And also there will be sectors who have lost out in some areas and need to regain market share in others. So they will be, like Sasol, they'll be looking at new types of capacity, new types of production, which previously was seen as not cost effective or not profitable enough. And they may well be re-looking at that and looking for the government to support them because they are providing an essential service to the South African economy. Right, KSB South Africa says the main reason for an improved supply chain, which included JIT, is to increase both efficiency and return on investment. The question is whether business owners and entrepreneurs can give up profit for a more robust system. I think they'll have to, because right now they're losing money. So yes, they got efficiency and they got a good return. But if those supply chains are not working now, they're losing money. So they will absolutely have to relinquish profit. They will have to find maybe opportunities elsewhere for profit, but they will definitely have to give up some profits in order to achieve that robustness. I do believe that that's a trend. Certainly if they're looking at expanding their supplier base, not all their suppliers are going to be willing or able to provide prices as low as the Chinese suppliers could provide. So if they're looking for other areas which are possibly less risk, they will have to be prepared to sacrifice some, which means that we as consumers may have to consider paying a little more. And that is not acceptable generally to consumers. It's not affordable in many cases, which then puts pressure on South African organizations to be able to supply those things and obviate the need to source internationally, but to supply them cost effectively. And so that means that some of the drivers of our economy need to be revisited quite significantly to be able to achieve that sustainability or that robustness. Good question. Let me see how we can get down here. Yikes. China will try by all means to counter the effects of COVID. How do you think China will rebuild global supply chain resilience after? China has not got a problem. It will achieve, sorry, there's someone trying to get in. It will achieve its old dominance easily. It's got capacity, it's got a lot of money. China has huge financial resources, so there's no problem. It also has invested hugely. China plays the long game. China's not about, 5 years between one election and the next. China's playing the long game. So it has built in a lot of resources to be able to recover from this. It won't be easy because people around the world have to believe that it's okay to source from China, because the connotation psychologically, people are concerned about buying things from China. A lot of the concerns are not actually relevant, but the point is people emotionally have a response. So they're going to have to rebuild their reputation. I don't think they're going to have a problem because there's a huge market out there. It does mean that perhaps in the short term, they won't have as much influence in global markets. I was looking at some research that was put out, and in 2008, 2009, when we had that financial crisis, China was only, I think, 4 or 5% of the global economy. Today, it's up to 19% of the global economy. So it's become far more influential, which means it's a far greater impact. I think that will be pushed back, certainly because they aren't going to be able to achieve the GDP numbers that they were in the past. So it will impact China in the short term, but in the long term, they have planned for the long game. They've got resources. They're going to push through this and try to attain the old position of influential economic impact around the world. And they have, if not short-term immediate resilience, they have resilience. We saw that in the fact that they were able to build a hospital, a very sophisticated hospital, in 10 days. And one could argue that it's really only possible in China because they've got a command economy. Essentially, they just pull the labor, they just put in the money, they force the whole thing through. Everybody complied. In a democracy, it might not be so easy to achieve that, but that tells us that they have got the ability, whether it's resources or capability, to achieve resilience very quickly. Building a hospital in 10 days has never, ever been even heard of, let alone achieved anywhere else. Oh, sorry. Let's get back to Njabulu. What measures can we as workforce do to get government to develop and protect our industries? Well, first of all, you're a voter, so you have a lot of clout. But as a workforce, I don't know what you can do except behind your organization. Because as an individual, you may not necessarily be able to speak to government other than through your vote. But as organizations, or as part of an organization, it certainly should be a discussion that should be put out there. And it has to include the unions, of course, because much of what government does is because it needs to listen to the unions and the workforce that is unionized. So a lot of what's happened today is a result of that dialogue in the past. So yes, there has to be a new dialogue, there has to be a new discussion, certainly on how government behaves and the things that it does in the future. We have to eradicate some of the practices which have happened in the past, certainly in the past 10 years, but they existed even before that. We have to eradicate those, and we have to start a new dialogue where the focus must be how do we protect jobs by incentivizing the re-emergence of manufacturing in South Africa, rather than getting all of that know-how from outside our borders. It won't be easy. I think all countries, even sophisticated economies like America, are struggling, but it's something we do have to do, because otherwise the solution of unemployment will be further and further and further out of our reach. Protectionism has limited benefits, and we've seen that in the recent spate between China and the USA. So effectively what's happened, America puts on tariffs, and the assumption is it punishes the Chinese because it makes Chinese imports more expensive. The reality of protectionism is that it actually makes the price of American goods higher for consumers. So it's really not a solution. An open dialogue and transparency, and a solution that makes both sides win. And that would assume, of course, that both sides are playing on an even playing field. And that's always difficult where you're working with a democracy, America, and another economy that's not working on democratic principles. So protectionism, it has, if any, benefits, they would only be very short term. I don't think they hold solutions in the longer term. And subsidies work well, but they are always, they incentivize operations at ineffective levels or in uncompetitive levels. I don't know that we'll get away from subsidies in the short term, certainly, but it does mean that an industry, and if we look at the agricultural industry in America, that only survives on subsidies, which is okay in the short term, but it does mean that farming in America is not as competitive as, say, farming in China. It's very hard for them to be as competitive because there are certain protections and costs that are inherent in the agricultural sector in America, which don't exist in China because China is a socialist, it's not a democracy, it's a closed economy. So it's not really a comparable situation. But subsidies can be effective, whether they're continued, because that would really speak to protectionism. And again, protectionism has short-term effects. It also means, for example, and here again I'm speaking of America, that farmers in America are not driven to be more productive and more efficient because they get subsidized. So they sell their products whether they're efficient or whether they're not efficient because they get money from the government. So if one could have a situation where initial subsidies would then promote the sophistication of that, so that in future that sector didn't necessarily need subsidization, perhaps it could be justified. Very interesting, Jabuli. Thank you for raising that. Okay, let me come down here. Minnie says, creating other forms of electricity, e.g. windmills, will this create sustainable electricity and more solar power plants? And has this been done by government? I don't know what our government is doing, but certainly there are signs that the government is open to discussion on these things. And very simply because they have no choice. Eskom has failed our economy dismally. So previously it is a monopoly. And there were laws that prevented anyone else from competing in that space. So let's look at an example of other countries. So for a variety of reasons, other countries have not moved in the same direction as South Africa did. So the motivation for South Africa's choices was good at the time. It just hasn't been sustainable. So if we look at Germany, for example, they have moved to clean energy. So yes, they had coal-fired power stations, but they have shut them down and they have compelled the energy providers to move to clean solutions. They, of course, have put a lot of money, the German government, into that. And they've done it because of environmental reasons. They haven't done it because they wanted cheaper energy. In fact, energy is costing them more because they have moved and forced the country to move to cleaner energy. So other countries, America, for example, hasn't necessarily moved to clean energy, but certainly it's opened up the energy space so that you have many service providers in America, and one can choose, as in the UK, you can choose where you buy your energy from. It, of course, is a big challenge because when you have privatized the supply of energy, it does mean that you can't control, as a government, the cost of energy. So it does require better relationships and support for these energy providers to make sure that they're still able to provide energy at an affordable cost. And we see that struggle in the UK because energy is expensive. However, it doesn't mean that offering cheaper energy at the cost of the environment so that everyone can have electricity is sustainable. Because we see now that the government hasn't got money, it's got to bail out Eskom, because Eskom is not able to produce energy at affordable prices, and certainly not to everybody, because that's the mandate of Eskom. So the question isn't really whether you should choose one model or another. I think one has to use all the models available, and one definitely has to look at clean energy. So whether we move away to wind power or solar power because Eskom is unable to produce, or whether we do it because it's just clean energy and we should be going in that direction anyway, we should be considering those opportunities. And we should, in any event, in the short term, we have to rely on Eskom. It's just too big a player in the space for us to ignore them. But I know that there's thinking in Eskom to move from coal-fired to other cleaner sources of power when they have the opportunity to do so, which again is not short-term. It will be a long-term solution. So government is certainly open to that. And there are a lot of examples around the world where the problem has been, oh gosh, there's Cecilia waiting for me, where the problem has been to some extent mitigated because we are engaging in conversations about other sources of power. And the biggest problem, of course, is money, because consumers want, and there are always more consumers joining the planet, and they will always want access to energy, and they would want affordability, because not all of them will be wealthy. So cheap energy is going to be a problem that continues into the future, and it's beholden on governments to actually find, ours included, find solutions that achieve most of the benefits that we want: affordable energy, clean energy, and an economy that is able to function because it has access to energy reliably. Okay. I'm trying to tweak this here. We could be more focused on buying South Africa or buying SA made and produced products in response to Ndabila's question. Yes, absolutely, Herman. That is the intention, to reindustrialize. We've lost, if we look at a country like Zambia to some extent, and if we look at certainly Zimbabwe, they've lost the capacity to industrialize. They aren't able to play in that space anymore, which is really, really sad. And we mustn't follow that path in South Africa. We must pull back that manufacturing and production capability back into our country. Right, let's see. Okay, I think we've actually run out of, oh, here's one more question. We'll take this one and then we should finish off. Okay, so Minnie says, how can the government better regulate the price we're currently paying due to COVID-19? The price we're paying for what? For energy or for products in general? We really don't necessarily want government regulation. Remember, government regulation is a command economy. That's what's happening in China. The prices are controlled by the government. We want the government to stay out of it. We want the market to determine what's fair. So currently, the government is, or through Eskom, is controlling the price of electricity. And the reason is government has no money to support Eskom, so it's expecting us as consumers to provide the money that Eskom needs. So in effect, we don't want the government to control the prices, but ultimately we want government to step in to protect our rights as consumers. And I saw last night on the news that Dis-Chem has been increasing prices, which they promised not to do. So we have bodies, the consumer protection bodies, for example, that go out and check on this. And effectively what government can do, it can fine companies, it punishes them for having taken advantage of our situation, our difficult situation in this COVID crisis. So that there would be a disincentive for players in the market space, suppliers, to take advantage of customers by increasing their prices when people can't actually afford it. So that's it. We've been going for an hour now. You must be tired of listening to me. Thank you for your participation, and thank you for your questions. I hope you've enjoyed this, and go home and think about, you're probably at home. I apologize. So when I leave you, think about this Black Swan event conundrum and what we can do to make sure, as individuals, to make sure that we are not caught unawares as individuals and as a country when the next event hits our economy. Thank you once again. Stay safe and have a splendid weekend.